Thanks, folks. We're going to get started right on time. That's going already, yes. Because we've got a full agenda in only an hour. So thank you very much for coming to this session on UBI and arts that we've got, which promises to be very, very interesting. So I will start on behalf of everyone by acknowledging that we're on the land of the Turrbal and Yuggera people and pay our respects to their elders past, present and those still to come, recognising this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and acknowledging the deep culture of the First Nations people that dates back since time immemorial and continues to this day. We've got 3 presentations today. Dario Vacirca here in person, then we're going to play a video from David Pledger and Jen Mills, and then we've got Sam Whiting, who was here and hopefully will be back soon to take part. So I'm going to hand straight over to Dario now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Is this one here? Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Greg, and all of the organisers of this event. It's been an amazing day already. Thank you for all being here. I'm going to do my little talk now. I'm pretty much going to read it out, and there's a bunch of slides to look at as well. Thanks for sitting in. So, as is probably clear from the title and the fact that I've been a practicing artist for as long as I can remember, I contend that arts practice and the artists who practice it are crucial to the development and proliferation of social ecologies. Why am I so certain about this? Because arts practice is free to interpret the material world and construct with it through time. Arts practice invites new ways of seeing, expresses new modes of becoming, and opens the space for multiplicities, difference, and radical formations to arise. In this talk today, I'm going to step through an argument which presses for the importance of this arts practice to be understood not only for its intrinsic value or for the labour involved in its function, but also for the transformative capacities that it has and will have in a post-work and post-capitalist society. I argue that creativity and care are crucial functions of the human being, and that the mutual aid it inspires can be the connective tissue between us and the more than human world. As such, if we want to bring on a post-work, post-capital world, the artist and the practices that they undertake must be valorised for the alternative economic, social, political, identitarian and time-based models that they engage in. In this talk, I'll touch on some speculative and real-world transformative art experiments and describe their community and perhaps even economic benefit. And I will show that key features of this speculative transformative arts practice are already proving to be important factors in translocal developments of universal and unconditional basic income. So yes, in the spirit of Olinde Rodriguez, who coined the term the avant-garde in 1825 and is propelled by the radical situationist Raoul Vaneigem, I am calling for economic and social transformation through the arts, led by artists. Not just of the arts, but through the arts across all sectors of society. However, to avoid warranted criticisms of the modernist notion of the avant-garde, in my provocation, the artist is not exceptional, not separate, not even unique. No, the artist is constituent of who we all can be. We can all lead through becoming artists. So, if the artist isn't any of these things, then what are they? In my view, The artist is dedicated to engaging in processes through time with the materialities that they are confronted with. They are dedicated to creativity, care, conviviality, and criticality. These attributes, I consider, are shared across all artistic practice, regardless of medium. More importantly, however, the artist is about self-determination. And as we all know and would agree in this room, this is what UBI can help manifest: a self-determined future that is simultaneously individual, autonomous, and collective, relational. However, the fulfillment of basic needs is not enough on its own to herald a social ecology of autonomous relationality. We will also struggle with multiple other forms of oppression that keep us down, regardless of cash flow. Therefore, any serious attempt to transform hegemony needs an intersectional and radical praxis that deconstructs the ideologies which form our perceptions of the economic, social, and political real. This means, 1, abolishing private property and land ownership as being the right of every individual in a competitive market. 2, questioning the validity of the nation-state governance, which continues to accumulate capital and power through extraction in continued disregard for the effects on dispossession and the health of the planet. And 3, reimagining relationship to static identity structures that are valorized through work and other normative frames. These intersectional praxes must be simultaneously addressed whilst we address the need for and the mechanisms of redistribution of wealth to the commons. As I've just outlined, and which is at the top of this presentation, creativity, care, and criticality are key attributes of arts practice, especially those that fall in the social practice category, or as I like to call it, radical cultural praxis. According to urban geographer Emma Power, in the neoliberal paradigm, quote, care is seen as a good that we can buy and sell as we need it, end quote. In this current system of care, the emphasis is on having a job, which gives one the chance to gain debt and make the money that is needed to pay for care. Instead, care ethics is an interpersonal practice where we attend to each other's emotional, physical, and spiritual needs in a process of mutual aid. Having an ethics of care as fundamental to the construction of social ecology would countervail for-profit-driven health systems, for-profit-driven housing and property markets, and the unrelenting acceptance of bullshit jobs or the guilt associated in refusing them, all of which produce a society of ambient anxiety that stresses to compete and to conform. In the practice of art, these ethics of care and responsibility can be extended into relations between materials, whether they be ideas, objects, systems, institutions, buildings, people, or others. In this context, criticality has a double meaning. It means critique of, insert whatever text you're focusing on, for example, power or work, and critical in the sense of it being urgent, vital, and necessary to undertake this critique. To be critical, therefore, means to engage in serious analysis of a crucial subject. Creativity is the first and most general category of a metaphysics of process and difference. As Alfred North Whitehead states, all actuality, quote, is in the grip of the ultimate metaphysical ground, the creative advance towards novelty, end quote. In my research, I observe that creativity is an approach, ethic, modality, and method to develop inquiry through a process of meshing multiple interconnected fields of affect and thought. Stated in slightly simpler terms, creativity is a powerful mechanism for bridging seemingly diverse fields while opening us through aesthetic active devices to new knowledge, empathy, and therefore possibility. Creativity, when combined with criticality and care, is understood as the possible constituent force of our personal, collective, and institutional lives. To critically engage with shifting to an ethics of care, therefore, we must develop a criticality that, in the words of artist Lara Diaz and sociologist Pascal Guillen, quote, provide spaces for resistance that contribute to the disarticulation of previous ideologies, ideological principles, and the rearticulation of new forms capable of inaugurating a new consciousness in the precariat, end quote. I argue that this praxis is vital for future post-capital and post-work social ecologies because it provides a foundation from which to re-explore relations to time, identity, kinship, and labour. Under neoliberalism, it is very difficult to find the time to work on such practices. When we are not coerced into working or looking for work, we are producing the conditions which allow us to do so, which includes caring for home, body, kin, and country. As we know from feminist Marxist analysis, this socially reproductive labour is necessary for the functioning of any economic social system, but unvalued and invisible under capital. For those who are employed, they may find themselves in what the late great David Graeber called a bullshit job, where meaningless busy work is undertaken to justify the time one is expending to be at work, to justify earning a wage, to keep the greasy wheels of capital turning. Or, if you're lucky enough, you might end up in a shit job that may be degrading, arduous, and poorly compensated, but which actually plays a useful role in society. Sometimes, though, there are ways and methods to break the bleak cycle of coercive labour, where we can engage in what Srinacek and Williams call voluntary labour flexibility, which provides the opportunity to work on projects that combine creativity, criticality, and care with the potential for transformational change. Now, since 2017, I've been very lucky to have had my basic material needs met through money automatically coming into my bank account. Firstly, through a generous scholarship from Deakin University to undertake my doctorate, and secondly, through the government's surprisingly generous extension of the welfare program resulting from pandemic lockdowns. Whilst both of these consistent streams of payments satisfied two of the three letters of our lauded acronym, B for basic and I for income, the important U was missing from both. The former was certainly not unconditional, in that I was required to produce a thesis in exchange, and the latter was not universal nor unconditional. However, these bootleg UBIs did give me the time to work on transformative art projects that focus on critical issues and research, and which otherwise I could not afford to pay me for all the time that I expended on them. In one of these projects, I was lucky enough to work with Quandamooka artist Megan Cope on Kinyangara Guwinyanba. Along with a team of other artists, I assisted Megan on her long-held ambition to create a traditional oyster reef on her ancestral land, Minjerribah, North Stradbroke Island. To realise it, we were tasked with collecting hundreds of logs upon which we sewed oyster shells before inserting them guerrilla style into a tidal bank. Over time, these rainmaker-like poles will attract oyster spat, eventually forming a traditional oyster reef. We will go back every year, plant more poles and tend to the bank. Megan is in the process of organising a barge for visitors to attend the bank, and which will act as a floating museum dedicated to this regenerative arts practice. Megan's project is transformative in multiple ways. It counters the destructive practices of large-scale Western oyster farming, opens a circular economic pathway for family living on country through sustainable traditional techniques, and works towards regenerating an ancient ecology of interconnected species through non-invasive and small-scale approaches considerate to all participants in its ecosystem. Another project that I've been able to work on in this time is the commoning of the Nicholas Building in Melbourne CBD. For those who don't know this iconic monolith, it's a 10-storey Art Deco marvel in the heart of Melbourne's Laneway district, a stone's throw from Flinders Street Station and Birrarung Mar. Over the last 40 years, it has organically grown to become a vertical creative precinct, housing over 200 tenants, crossing every sector of the creative industries. I've been a tenant in the building on and off since 2004, and in 2017 became a director of the Nicholas Building Association. In 2021, the building was put on the market for the first time in half a century. Fearing we would lose our creative homes to commercial investors seeking a significant return on investment through increasing rents and or converting our studios into boutique hotel rooms, apartments, or just more expensive and unnecessary corporate offices, the association ran a successful campaign which has seen the creative tenant community becoming a condition of sale. We've also set up a for-purpose foundation which will hold a long-term lease ensuring the building remains a vibrant, self-determined creative hub. Through the security of this tenure and investments we are attracting into our social enterprise model, we are developing an annual arts and cultural program, reanimating the 1920s ballroom, and establishing a public pavilion on the rooftop. Basically, we're in the process of commoning a commercial property that's worth $80 million on the open market. Ultimately, it is our intention that it becomes a community-run cultural space in perpetuity, never to be sold again. There are hundreds of other transformative art projects that use social practice to intervene and alter systemic inequalities, including Jonas Stahl's New Embassy Summit, Cassie Thornton's The Hologram Project, Joachim Klaus's Shelter, Host Street Central Bank, and The Common Wallet. I won't detail them now because I don't have time, but I will show you slides and you can read a little bit about them as I keep going. All of these projects critically engage in creative acts of care and exemplify how such praxis is important in shifting paradigms of competition, accumulation, static identity, and coercive work. And they all, in their own unique, context-specific way, display what is possible when people's basic needs are covered and hence become freed to pursue processes, procedures, and projects that engage in speculative aesthetics which have consequences that reach far beyond the art world. These are the kind of transformative artworks I refer to when describing an artist-led economy. They are creative in that they create new or transversal modes of working with material conditions and do so through the lens of aesthetics. They are critical in that they address social needs and confront modes of oppression, power, and inequality, and they are all acts of radical care. In a world without work, we're going to need more of these kinds of projects, operating outside of government, corporate, and institutional frameworks. These mutual aid projects will require more people with more time to spend on the creative labour required to produce such praxis. They will provide the mechanisms through which people can relearn relationships to time, identity, land, and labour that will be necessarily unlearned in a post-work economy. Almost finished. The essential political and practical industrial shifts required to get to this point will first entail a radical cultural shift where the values of creativity, care, and criticality are made central to how we understand society. It will involve a reversal of thinking about the role which economy, governance, and industry play in the creation of our subjectivities. This will entail a counter-hegemonic project across all sectors which deconstructs current ideologies, replacing them with a nomadic methodology that is at all times working creatively, critically, and caringly to undermine new ideologies which might form and become concrete. This essential shift should be led, in my view, by artists, because we know time, adaptation, flexibility, and the disarticulation and rearticulation of identities, both autonomous and collective. These traits will be required to deal with fears around post-work disidentification and will, in the words of radical situationist Raoul Vaneigem, lead to a world where there are no more artists because everyone is an artist. The work of art of the future will be the construction of passionate life. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dario. So much to chew on there and think about. We might take one quick question while we're swapping on to the video now. Does anyone have a quick question that they would like to ask Dario?
I know I just bombarded you all, so you probably don't have a question. No.
No, it's excellent. All right. Well, we will. Question from back.
Yeah, are you worried about that artists are being used to solve social problems through programs? Because I've seen this a lot with mental health. That they, the funding gets kind of put together, and instead of
Yeah, no, totally, absolutely. When it's instrumentalized and not artist-driven or creative-driven, when it's driven by institutions or government or policy, it's always a problem that art is kind of taken apart and becomes a servant to whatever policy of the day. Yes, it's a major problem. But what I'm talking about is that these projects need to be artist-led. They have to be creative-led, community-led. They need to actually come out of the need and be driven by the people that are engaging them. And hence why UBI is important, because that's how it can be paid for. If you're working in mental health, or you're working in education, or any of the other spaces where artists are utilised to do that kind of socially reproductive labour that's important, you're beholden to those policies and those regulations and the needs of the institution, because they're the ones paying for you. So yeah, I'm not concerned if it's done in a radical way. I mean, obviously, all of these things have to be, including any way of ever trying to implement UBI. It is radical and needs to be done in a radical kind of, political and active way across all sectors.
Great, thank you. Agreed. And that seems to be a common theme with so much of today, of course. Do it right. Great. We're going to go now to a video that has been recorded by David Pledger and Jennifer Mills.
How'd you like to do it?
I think I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Ghana country and that sovereignty was never ceded.
Hello, my name's David Pledger. I'd like to acknowledge that I am speaking from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, where I work and live and dream. This is Jen Mills, and we are going to present a short conversation, an in-conversation around the dynamics of the UBI in the arts sector from our different perspectives, working in this space for some years, and we're going to cover a little bit of ground. It's going to be a wide-ranging conversation, so we'll keep our eye on the clock and hope that it's worthwhile for all those that are listening. We've decided to do a sort of question. We're going to do it in conversation, so a kind of question format. So we're going to ask each other questions and answers, and then see how it goes from there. So, Jen, would you like to begin and maybe talk about?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you actually how the arts funding landscape has shifted over the last 40 years, and particularly over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, and what kind of effect that has had on working artists.
Yeah, well, I think probably I can speak reasonably well going back until 1990, so that's probably the last 30 years where there was a kind of measurement that has been sort of really kind of worked through, where from 1990 to 2010, in terms of direct funding to artists, and by direct funding I mean money that goes directly into the pockets of artists, there was a 1/3 decrease. So that's over a 20-year period. There was 1/3 less money available that was going across the arts agencies of Australia, and that was around state and national territories. And that was at a time when obviously real costs of living were increasing. So it didn't just drop a bit, it dropped like that. So the gap got created in that time. From 2010 to 2020, let's just say just before the pandemic, there was a period in which, and there's a statistic that was that Alison Krogan came up with and investigated, there was a 70% decrease over a period of, I think, about 6 or 7 years. So it's 70% on top of the 1/3 decrease over the previous 20 years. So going into the pandemic, as we know, there's been very little money that's found its way into artists' pockets. So where we are at the moment is we're largely at a stage where there is a negligible amount of taxpayers' money that is allocated to the arts ending up in the pockets of artists to make their work and to simply live, put food on the table, and to feed their families and social networks.
Yeah, that there was a study, I think, that things were very bad before the pandemic, and I feel like the pandemic has just sort of cemented a lot of divisions between sort of those who are well off and those who aren't, and artists who have some inherited wealth or other means of supporting themselves are surviving, and a lot of people are burning out now that the support structures that were there for a limited time in the pandemic have gone. There was a report, I think it was 2017, David Throsby making artwork for the Australia Council, and even then, that was 5 years ago. And the Australia Council at the time said, you know, it's increasingly difficult for artists to make a living from their work.
I think what happens also is when that happens, the artist population decreases. And so I think in the 2010s it flatlined. So historically, despite the fact that there'd been a third drop off of direct funding over 20 years, I think in that 2010s there was the artist population flatlined. So that's a real indicator, because it means that as the population of Australia is increasing, actually it becomes a small percentage of the overall working population of the country. And then I think in the last few years of the 2010s, it started to decline. And anecdotally, many people are saying, and I'm really saying this in terms of conversations I have with colleagues in various parts of the sector, that between 15 and 20% of that artist population, which was just under 50,000, is now has now left the arts completely and gone into other industries. So it's a desperate situation for artists and the arts, and if we believe that the arts is a measure of the health of democracy, then it's a desperate situation for our social democracy. So, you know, I think you and I are looking at the problem from multiple points of view and trying to look at where the pressure points are, which is why I feel like we've come to this idea of like, what's a solution? What are the solutions here? And again, there are many, I think, but one of the ones that we've been talking about is a basic income for the arts. When you've, in your work that you're doing at the moment, you're a resident, you're at Vital Statistics, you are the, what's your actual title there now?
I'm an artist in residence there, David, and it's a really rare opportunity because the organisation, which is a radical theatre company, has employed me as an artist in residence on a salary 2 days a week. So I'm earning the same as anyone else in the organisation does, and I'm doing a lot of work for them and research into art as labour. But it's also the first time in 15 years of freelancing and writing full-time that I've had sick leave and superannuation and a regular paycheck. And it's made a huge difference to my sort of my work structure. I'm not sort of panicking around paying the rent. I can accept things like, so at the moment, for example, I'm waiting on about $3,000 worth of unpaid invoices, and the pressure of having to chase that up. I could spend a day trying to chase that up before my rent is due, but because I have this regular fortnightly payment, I don't have to worry about that. So in a way, it's a little test case of a different model instead of using project funding to fund somebody on a salary. And I think it's something that should be considered by arts organisations and actually any organisation. But it's extra work because I am doing work for the organisation. So they're not just paying me to do my own creative practice. They're also paying me to work for the organisation, and some of that is documentation and research and stuff around these issues.
And so in that way, I mean, just personally, your sort of work in the space of labour and work, it has an activist sort of, impulse. You're writing a lot about those things. Do you feel like I look at the way that you work and how you describe yourself, and I often feel like, well, that's a very contemporary sort of description of tasks for an artist, that they need to balance their artistic practice with their activist practice, because without their activist practice, they won't be able to practice their art. And that is, the artist these days is very much, I won't say an artivist because that means something else, but you have to have those two kind of, the activist and the artist needs to sit really, quite intimately in that one mind and body.
And we're under so much pressure that I honestly think if you're not an activist, then you're letting art down, because we need to create the conditions in which arts and culture can thrive in our society. That's part of being a responsible practitioner. You don't just make work for your own ego. You want to create a world in which arts and culture thrive. And that's not a box ticking grant application statement. We need to really look hard at what the conditions of our work are.
Mm-hmm.
Governments like to talk a lot about participation in the arts and well-being, but how can you encourage participation when the majority of artists are living below the poverty line? Half of writers make less than $15,000 a year from their creative work. I'm one of them. And so it's, we're not creating the conditions in which people can live off their art, and far from it. People are having to go and take multiple day jobs and things. So you end up having to sort of be strategic about, well, which bits of the world do I need to change and which bits of my own practice do I need to change to survive in this?
Yeah. And so you've actually been, the stories that you get from artists, you've been interviewing quite a few artists in terms of what their own lived experience is. Is there a kind of what's the picture? What's the portrait of the artist at the moment in terms of their kind of how do they behave? What's a day look like for an artist in the stories that you've accumulated so far?
Yeah, so there is no typical day. I think everybody is sort of scrambling and hustling and trying to make it work all the time. I'm writing an article at the moment about adhocracy, which is Vital Statistics' annual development lab for experimental art projects, and it's very collaborative and it's very exciting, and I used it as an opportunity to interview a lot of artists about these issues. And I actually have some statements that artists made to me in those interviews that I wanted to share with folks, because it's very interesting to hear the testimony. One said, I have to get at least 25 jobs a year. Some of them are only $500 jobs, but I still have to apply for them. I like to have a lot of different jobs, but I have to be really careful and manage my energy. One said, constantly having to bridge the gap between projects is really stressful. The mental health impacts are huge. A lot of things come down to housing. The reliance on goodwill and unpaid labour makes it borderline impossible to keep doing this past your 20s, said one artist. Another said, our love and care for each other can make us easy to exploit. Another artist said, I see my art as a responsibility, as a form of civic participation, which comes back to what you were saying earlier, I think. People said things like grants determine the work that gets made. One artist said, my art practice basically consists of applying for grants. Another spoke about being in an artist community. and said that when she was working for direct exchange of labour, she found a profound relief.
Yeah.
And a few people said something along these lines: we should fund artists, not projects.
Yeah. Yeah, which is a great lead into, a basic income for the arts and what it looks like and what it can offer, because we all know from our experience that if we have money in our pocket, artists are relentless. They're complex makers. They're compulsive often. They really, the idea that if you get a basic income for the arts, it's just going to mean that people get money to sit at home is completely perverse. I've never experienced in any of the systems that I've been engaged with internationally that that's ever the case. Artists want to make, they need to make. If you fund the artists rather than the projects, then you're going to get a lot of stuff that's going to get made, and the quality of it, I believe, will improve considerably, and the potential for a kind of cultural renaissance is real, and the sensibility of artists and the way in which they are perceived and operate in society improves. The way in which society actually talks about itself and talks to itself is made more generous because of the increased levels of nuance and the safe spaces that the arts creates for very difficult conversations to occur. So they're all the kinds of things that, I think are really that a basic income for the arts can achieve globally. And for artists, I feel like if you are in a position where you're in at the moment where you're guaranteed 2 days a week income and you can just relax, you don't have that anxiety, then the kinds of work and the way that you think and how you think and the conversations that you can have just really are much richer and much more, in some ways, I think, perhaps public facing. They're actually looking at making meaning in society. So I'm not sure how you feel like what a basic income for the arts would actually impact on on the broader community.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you've said about these kind of democratic conversations that the arts make possible really resonates with me. But I also think there's that question of public value. Like, how do we show our society or demonstrate as a society that we've chosen to make arts and culture one of the valuable things that we do? And the way that we've been pretending to do it is through these creative industries, treating art as an industry. But how can you have an industry where everyone's poor and broke and overworked and burning out? Like, that's not a successful industry, is it?
Yeah. The arts industry is the template for how not to create and operate an industry.
Yeah. And also how not to make art a lot of the time.
Make art, yeah. I mean, that point that artist was saying about, I basically make art according to what the criteria, I call that application art. And I think application art is what predominates, in this place that we live in. Really, people are actually making application art. They're not making the art that they feel needs to be made. They're making the art that they feel they can get funded to make, and that's incredibly problematic. And it makes that process of across the board, socially and mechanically, as a transaction. And when art becomes a transaction, then it starts to lose its soul and its efficacy and its agency and its spirit. And we need more of that at the moment. I guess before we finish up, maybe we should just try and work our way through how do we think? What projects might we kind of think about that can kind of enable a basic income for the arts?
Yeah, look, I'm watching Ireland very closely, the trial that's just started there, which has 2,000 practicing artists now enrolled in a basic income scheme. I do think that we can actually achieve a lot of what we want to achieve by getting rid of mutual obligation and increasing the dole to a living wage standard, or even just a livable standard. because it used to be, I think, the case well before I was a writer, unfortunately, but I think it used to be the case that artists could get by on the dole and make the kind of art they wanted to make. And that kind of shift would not just help artists, that would help everybody.
Yep. Yep. I mean, I was had social security for probably off and on for probably 10 years once I got out of drama school. And I made a commitment after 10 years that I wouldn't do it anymore. I was heading overseas because I got a job overseas. And from that moment on, when I made that commitment, I really became somebody who made, created and produced and also employed a lot of other artists. And I couldn't have done that without that, and the initial sort of off and on for 5 to 10 years of having access to a social security that only asked limited amounts of questions about my integrity. I was committed to what I wanted to do, and I had that support. And from my own experience, I feel like that's an absolute, that's an evidence that a social security system that has a kind of humanity at its core actually generates many more benefits in society than a social security system that really has, I don't know what you call robo-debt, but whatever that was that an evil?
Dystopian.
A dystopian, yeah, at its core. Then you get exactly the opposite. So I agree with you. I think there's certain things that, we want to put into this space where, in terms of what a solution might be. What about a pilot project?
Yeah, I think a pilot project in the arts that's looking to basic income for everybody makes a lot of sense to me, because artists are very good at self-reporting. We like to be experimented on, and we could also have a lot of fun with the kind of art that we make, and produce conversations out of the experience. Do what art does best: stimulate thought and discussion and ideas. I do think, though, that basic income shouldn't just be for artists. It shouldn't be a different form of arts funding. It shouldn't replace project funding or fair pay in the arts, which is a really important thing to fight for. But, it could enable us to dedicate some of our time to the kind of collaboration and organising that is often unpaid work that we do, and the care work that we do for each other as well in the arts, which has been so important over the last couple of years.
Yeah. I think thinking about a basic income for the arts in a kind of rhizomatic way is it's one of a number of things that needs to be put in place if we're to retain the artist population, and if we're to increase it, and if we're able to kind of respect labour. That a BIA is one of a number of measures that we need to do. It's not to replace something, but it is a big I feel, to what is already there. And hopefully by doing that, you change the conversation around the basic value of the arts, which is intrinsic to all of the things that we've been discussing, I reckon.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can open that out further to have broader conversations, more utopian conversations about, why do we work the way that we do? What does hyper-productivity achieve? And how can we make an economy based on creativity more of a degrowth economy or a circular economy? We've really got to rethink labour more broadly, and artists are going to be able to open ways into that conversation for everybody.
Yes, such rich material for artists to work in, and they're already working in those spaces. But for that to be to come out and be made more available and public and a bigger part of the conversation, is something that will be problematic if we don't do it. And if we do it, then things can happen quite quickly, I think, in that space, because language is the key. Language creates momentum in that space. So it means that if it's allowed to be freed into that space, then things can happen quite quickly. So I don't know, I'm optimistic.
Well, you're an expert in this field of art and social change, David, and I feel more optimistic when I speak to you about it as well.
Thanks, Jen. That was a good chat. I guess we're close to the end of our time, so maybe we should just wave and say hello back to people in the room. And
Yeah, I'm happy to wrap it up there. I hope it's been useful for everybody. I look forward to listening to the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, me too. Cheers. Thanks, everybody.
Let's hand over to Sam Whiting for another presentation in the room.
Thanks,
Sam.
Thank you. Oh, it's already on here. Yeah. Please go and do watch that. Jen's a friend, and she sent me that presentation already. And it's a great discussion. Just grab my notes. I feel like we've had a really lovely progression from revolution to reflection and now reform. Maybe not as ambitious as Dario, but I really love that presentation. So I'm Dr. Sam Whiting. I'm a lecturer in creative industries from the University of South Australia, and I'll be speaking on basic income, cultural labour, and the creative arts precedents and current experiments today. And just before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on traditional lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, and that I currently live and work on the land of the Kaurna people. I wish to formally recognise their elders, families and forebears and acknowledge that they are the traditional custodians of the land and have been so for millennia. I acknowledge that the land in which we meet is stolen land, that sovereignty was never ceded and treaties are yet to be negotiated. I'd also like to add a caveat that what I'm discussing today is particularly new research for me. I'm a cultural sociologist, I guess you'd say, cultural studies mixed with empirical research. And this paper is an important opportunity for me to test new ideas. I'm seeking constructive feedback on these ideas as I work them up towards a DECRA application later this year. So feel free to give me some feedback. So since the 2008 global financial crisis, new ways of thinking about macroeconomics and how it might better serve our communities and society have gathered steam. I don't need to tell you all this. Some of these are old ideas rebranded for the digital age. So a federal job guarantee, popular in Western democracies during the post-war period, have re-entered popular discourse, often trailing arguments for its proposed funding mechanism, modern monetary theory, and coupled with other state-administered social welfare programs, such as universal basic services. Arguably an even older idea, universal basic income is another popular solution to the current insecurity and haphazardness plaguing labour markets and the reason why we are gathered all here today. So, however, across the deluge of think pieces, op-eds and TED Talks on these ideas, their potential impacts on the arts, cultural industries and cultural labour more broadly were largely overlooked. That is until the pandemic thrust these already under-resourced and overstretched sectors out of the frying pan of what was pretty poor public policy before the pandemic and into the bin fire of lockdowns, zero funding support, and the mass exodus of experienced workers from the arts and cultural industries. So since then, calls for a basic income for artists have grown to fever pitch, yet the idea alongside the impact of heterodox economics on arts and culture more broadly remains under-examined as a scholarly research. So following what has been a monumental shift in the realities of what is possible for the role of public policy post-pandemic, today I wish to discuss a basic idea, giving free money to artists to do their work. Sounds simple enough, yet there are assumptions in this statement that require further unpacking. Giving by who and to whom? What conditions are implied within this exchange? We've had a lot of great discussion about conditionality today. Free money, why the caveat free? Why not just money? Conditionality again. Artists, how do we define artists? And Dario made a great point. With a universal basic income, we would all be artists. And I think that's something we should absolutely aspire to. But also, who defines what an artist is? What are their motives? Work. What is cultural labour? What are the material and social conditions necessary for cultural labour to take place? So to answer such questions would take up more time than I have here today. However, the question of cultural or creative labour is worth discussing in some more depth. So work in the arts, cultural labour, or so-called creative industries is commonly viewed from a positive perspective as desirable because it supposedly offers less alienating work, characterized by aesthetic and professional autonomy, a less formal and hierarchical work environment than traditional employment, and greater levels of social prestige. Alternatively, of course, many argue that the reality of creative work under neoliberalism is one marked by insecurity, high levels of exploitation and self-exploitation, and the corrosion of work-life demarcations, as the social networks of friends and family are put to work for business purposes. Moreover, the extension of freelance and contract work into the cultural sector, so that gig economy coming full circle, has affected the expectations of a new generation of young aspirants seeking to establish a career in the arts. Cultural labour intersects with other forms of labour, such as immaterial and affective labour. However, it is distinct from these in a specific goal of producing culture. I refer here to Raymond Williams's iconic three definitions of culture, specifically his third, independent and abstract noun, which describes the works and practices of intellectual and especially artistic activity. So within the context of this paper, cultural or creative labour, as it is otherwise defined in the literature, refers to the material production of works of intellectual and artistic activity. However, this doesn't really give us a fix on what cultural labour actually is and what it looks like. So to put it in perspective, cultural labour might look like Ursula Le Guin's daily writing regime, where she leaves room for reflection, for play, for correspondence, for interaction. I think it's quite a beautiful routine. Or Hunter S. Thompson's debaucherous schedule. Although this has been debunked as fake news. Unfortunately, despite its habits of resurfacing every 2 to 3 years as effective clickbait. For those more gullible of internet users, see Joe Rogan, who seems to think this is what he did every day. Joe Rogan was convinced of this. Anyway, regardless of the accuracy of these two examples, it is important to note that cultural labour is never homogenous. And as Hesman, Hogue and Baker state, the tensions and contradictions between economics and culture, creativity and commerce are organisationally and industrially specific and need to be identified when speaking of cultural or creative labour. Indeed, the effective funding and resourcing of creative labour is a particularly unique problem because of that lack of homogeneity. So heterogeneous and describing many styles of work, creative labour as both A, creative conception, and B, creative reproduction, limits the potential to effectively style a one-size-fits-all economic policy model to suit all creative practices and types of cultural production. However, it is useful to think about how these labour practices are resourced. A painter needs paints, a studio space to experiment within, and a canvas to explore. Musicians need instruments, some sort of training, whether self-taught or trained via more formal means. Both require the investment of time and often capital. Video game designers need both software and hardware. Dancers need specialist footwear and a studio. Writers require an amenable space, materials, often access to resources for research purposes, such as archives, other written works. So whether you're a graphic designer or a classical musician, all creative and cultural labour needs to be resourced, which involves an initial and often ongoing outlay of either time or capital. And time is something that Dario pointed to before, and I think it's the fundamental thing that makes cultural labour specific. Therefore, any economic model that seeks to resource the arts broadly needs to keep this in mind. What we can identify from this as being specific to cultural labour is spare, unmitigated and unimpeded time to pursue one's work, as well as the tools and space to do it. In an academic context, cultural or creative labour has certain things in common with writing and research, or the scholastic point of view, as Pierre Bourdieu might term it. In particular, academic labour and cultural labour both rely on certain elements of the concept of school. So, as it was defined by Bourdieu, school refers to the leisure time that scholars and researchers have in which to explore new ideas and points of inquiry, something increasingly rare within the neoliberal university. So derived from the Greek for school, it implies spare time, leisure, rest, ease, idleness, and learned discussion. In his 1989 lecture on the scholastic point of view, Bourdieu quotes Plato in reference to school as to play seriously. Although privilege and material abundance are implied in the pursuit of any such activity, the role of spare time is particularly significant alongside the basic questions of resourcing, i.e. capital, tools, the means of production, the means of cultural production, mind you, etc. Much like the scholastic point of view, the artistic perspective requires spare time for reflection and engagement. However, also like the academic experience, cultural labour is work. It's hard work, it's skilled work, it's difficult work, and any leisure time of reflection and thought is followed by the making, the doing, the work. In seeking to resource such work effectively, a radical yet simple idea is being trialled in Ireland right now, giving free money to artists. The Republic of Ireland has recently instituted a new scheme to provide 3 years of support to up to 2,000 individual artists, piloting a form of basic income. While this does not meet the criteria of universal basic income, given its limited application within a specific industry, so it's very conditional, it does provide an opportunity to consider what artists are capable of when they are financially resourced simply for being artists. As Jen Mills and David Pledger pointed out earlier in today's panel, funding the artist, not the project. And our grants-based system really just favours projects. So qualification for the scheme relies on meeting 2 out of 3 conditions. Have previously earned an income from the artist. I mean, that's pretty narrow and vague. Have an existing body of work and or be a member of a recognised arts body, such as a trade union. So these are conditions that allow for both emergent, established and late career artists. And while we could problematise these all day, I think that they do allow some wriggle room in the assessment criteria to allow for different types of artists at different stages in their career. What is an artist is a question that I don't have time to answer right now. So successful artists and creative workers will be given a weekly income of €325, so it's 479 Australian a week, and so that's a bit less than minimum wage, and be able to earn additional money without this basic income being affected. Although this is slightly less than the current minimum wage in Ireland, it does provide a substantial financial floor for artists and cultural workers, providing them with the freedom to focus more time on the creative practice than they would otherwise. Whilst the Irish trial is the largest trial of a basic income for artists in recent times, with similar limited trials being offered in San Francisco and New York City, direct support for artists dates back to the days of medieval patronage, which has been adapted by digital platforms such as Patreon to fund individual content creators. However, the key difference between the patron model, which promotes the production of culture favoured by those with spare capital lying around, i.e. usually those with privilege, that want curated content. So the difference between that and a basic income for artists is that the BIA prioritises the artists and places no conditions on the types of culture to be produced. So although this all seems rather out of reach within an Australian context, wherein the arts and artists have been denigrated by politicians and policymakers for such a long time, despite its flaws and omissions, the recent JobKeeper wage subsidy scheme provides a blueprint for a basic income for artists, something unthinkable prior to the pandemic. And JobSeeker, of course, we've talked about the role that's played in offering like a window into what's possible. As a macroeconomic intervention within the cultural sector, JobKeeper and JobSeeker also had much in common with another successful example of basic income for artists, the French Intermittent du Spectacle Unemployment Insurance Scheme. Created in the 1930s to subsidise film industry workers alternating between short-term contracts and periods of unemployment, the Intermittent du Spectacle has since been expanded to cover a variety of cultural workers and guarantees a government-subsidised stipend eligible to those who have worked a minimum number of hours in the cultural or artistic field, acting as a sort of unemployment insurance scheme. So it acknowledges the contract-based work of artistic work and that there's often gaps in income and provides a sort of financial floor. Although the scheme has been under attack by successive neoliberal governments in France, it still presents a gold standard in how to support working artists, lifting the standing of culture to one of national pride. However, such a policy requires political consensus around the provision of culture as a basic government service and a public good, alongside health, education, and other social services. This emphasises a political economy approach to cultural policy and therefore hinges on a refusal and rejection of neoliberal creative industries rhetoric that seeks to further privatise cultural labour and its products. Unlike a basic income for artists, the intermittence du spectacle is administratively burdensome, and there's a lot of critiques for it. And it's also prone to abuse by both workers and employers, because I think it is administered. I think employers have a say in how it's administered. So this is why unrestricted basic income without mutual obligations offers a viable alternative. Speaking of mutual obligations, and as mentioned previously by Jen Mills, unemployment benefit schemes in Australia and Britain, otherwise known as the dole, offered a financial lifeline for many arts and cultural workers prior to the introduction of mutual obligations or other work for the dole schemes. In Australia in particular, an entire generation of artists, comedians, musicians, and actors emergent during the 1980s and early 1990s were able to draw a living wage from the dole whilst concentrating on their artistic practice. As confirmed by David Pledger in the panel just before, arguably the majority of Generation X that are still actively employed or engaged in the Australian cultural industries today have the dole to thank for at least the earliest parts of their careers, as it offered an opportunity for them to focus on their craft when they were at the peak of their youth. Of course, other material conditions such as cheaper housing, a well-funded arts infrastructure, and a much better resourced public broadcaster in the ABC, as well as a more vibrant community radio and media landscape, assisted this generation. But it is unsurprising that Generation X has managed to dominate much of the media and entertainment space in Australia. And more research is needed to explore the link between what was at the time an expanded and reasonable unemployment benefit scheme and a golden age in grassroots cultural production led by a young Gen X. Large-scale public support for cultural labour is not radical and it is not new. The Depression-era Works Progress Administration of Roosevelt's New Deal United States funded the Public Works of Art project, hiring more than 10,000 artists to create public works of art across the country in a wide variety of forms: murals, theatre, fine arts, music, writing, design, and more. This not only resourced artists to do the work in which they were most qualified during a time of economic upheaval, but also fostered a sense of national culture and identity in a period when fascism and authoritarianism was on the rise. Although fascist regimes, of course, used arts and culture as propaganda, the WPA empowered artists to take liberties with their depiction of modern American life at the time, as the only guidance the government offered about subject matter was that the American scene would be a suitable topic. The Public Works of Art project helped to establish the careers of photographer Dorothea Lange, artist Jackson Pollock, composer Aaron Copland, writer Ralph Ellison, and painter Mark Rothko, and had a lasting cultural impact that shaped the American psyche for generations. Although the Public Works of Art project has many more similarities with a federal job guarantee than a basic income, the impact of direct, unrestricted support for the arts was monumental and fundamentally changed America's cultural landscape. Other modern ideas aimed at reshaping our macro political and economic circumstances would also heavily influence the potential for cultural labour to thrive and for the potential for us all to become artists. The 4-day or 30-hour working week would expand the amount of leisure time available to hobbyist, amateur, or part-time artists without a reduction in wages or salaries. Such an initiative would also free up time for casual enthusiasts and audiences to engage with cultural work more readily, simultaneously expanding the number of producers, participants, and consumers of arts and culture, although I hate that word consumers. Such an expansion in our ability to make, to create, to play, to entertain, and to be entertained is really the end goal here. Not only because it would teach us how to value cultural labour and to engage with it more readily, but because it would also greatly expand our general well-being, our sense of civic engagement, and our capacity to build shared values and stories. And although art may not be as badly needed now as vaccines, universal healthcare, or a rapid decarbonisation of our economy, funding artists to produce work that reflects these goals and challenges and our shared culture may heal a few other sicknesses in our communities, because survival is insufficient. Thank you.
So good, Sam. Thank you very much. 3 excellent presentations. We've got a couple of minutes for questions before we all have to go down to the next session. And I'm chairing the next session as well downstairs. So a couple of minutes. Who's got something to grill? Yeah, great.
Really quickly, but Sam, I was just thinking about your project and thinking about the Deca where to extend it to thinking about craft as well as art.
Yeah.
And just for instance, excellent talk about the fact of things that are created value in terms of reclaiming craft and that skill of producing something of value, even like a table that we can then sit around and discuss and dialogue or share and so on. I think that's really important, particularly in circular economy, where we're encouraging people to reuse more.
Absolutely.
And reclaiming those kind of craft.
Yeah.
And just to Dario, I was thinking about everyone forced to become an artist has to move away from that, Borges notion of distinction to, that sense that fine art, particularly to certain elitist form of knowledge that needs to interpret the art. I think that, you saying that we all need to become an artist is going to require the democratisation of the arts and artistic practice are going to, but we can also make a contribution in terms of creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. It's inside of everyone. Yeah. And it's like, actually, that it's interesting because I'm not actually saying that everybody should or could become an artist. It's about the opportunity for people to make that determination.
Yeah.
And the way our current funding structures work, it's all about exceptionalism, it's all about excellence, it's about competition, and it's assessed on truly weird and bizarre subjective kind of principles, which just do not allow for anybody to get to that point where they can sit at the table and go, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do with our time?
Any other super quick question?
I'm just thinking in terms of the 4-day week, great idea. I already work a 4-day week simply because I have a disability. So for me, that's as full-time as I can get. Is there any thinking happening about how that kind of works?
Well, there needs to be. Yeah, I think I'm not an expert in terms of the labour industrial policies that would have to face to be able to get the 4-day week up. But I think it would have to allow for diversity of the workforce, diversity of people's capacity to work, because otherwise it would just entrench more inequality.
I think we're going to have to wrap. Yep. And head downstairs. Thank you very much for coming along to this section, everyone. Thank you to our wonderful presenters. See you downstairs.